Hey there, Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with another episode of Cheap Shots, our series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we will show you how to quickly and cheaply paint Espern Lorcano, the Imperial Navigator, for your games of Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. And by following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, you can paint your miniature to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $19. And when you compare that from materials that you'll need to purchase from Army Painter and Citadel, we will help you to save over $141 at exactly the same time. So with that being said, let's go out and talk about how we can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up Espern Lorcano for Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. So the first thing you need to do, of course, is to assemble texture as well as prime your miniature, which will be really simple to do considering that this is actually a pushpin fit type of miniature, so it's really easy to assemble. At the same time, once you have your miniature assembled, the next thing you do, of course, is to texture your bases. Now, the texturing that I like to use is a combination of sand and wood glue. What I do is I take some wood glue and an old paintbrush, and I paint it directly on the part of the base that I want to have texturing on, and then I dust it with some sand that I get from my backyard. And once it dries, what I do is I make a slurry, making a combination of 50% wood glue with 50% water, make it into a nice slurry, and then paint it like a wash all over the texturing and let it dry. What this does, it creates an airtight seal to make sure that your texturing does not come flicking off your base, and it's very cheap and it's just using materials that are laying around the house. You could, of course, use Astrogranite, which is made by Games Workshop Citadel line in order to do this, but that costs $50 a pot, while there's just sand and wood glue. It's just materials that are lying around your house. Now, once you have your texturing done, next thing you do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. For me, priming does a couple of things. The first thing that priming does, of course, is that it creates a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to when you paint directly onto your miniatures. Unfortunately, if you were to take your acrylic paints and try to paint on bare plastic, what would end up happening is that the surface tension of the acrylic paints won't stick to the actual bare plastic, so the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to rub right off your miniature, which could, of course, ruin the overall finish. So because of that, priming kind of takes care of that. The second thing that priming also does too is it does have an impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you put on your miniature. Traditionally speaking, the more bright and vibrant colors that you want for a paint job for your miniature, the lighter the primer you go, whereas the more subdued or the darker the color, the darker the primer you go with. And so we're using a quick paint method on this miniature, meaning that we'll be using an oil wash that will darken down the vibrancy of the colors that we use. We'll use a flat white primer to do this. Now, the primer I like using is Rust-Oleum flat white primer. You can find this at your local Walmart for about $3.99. I just give it the once over real quick, and of course I just move on from there. You could, of course, use Clorox white spray that's made by Games Workshop Citadel line, but that costs $17 a can as opposed to $4 that I get from Walmart. So next thing we do, of course, is to work on the main colors of this miniature, and actually there's one major color that's used throughout most of it, which is a nice vibrant purple color. Espern Lorcano has actually got a really big great coat as well as robes that he wears, and they're both purple in color. So to do this, I use Wild Iris by Apple Barrel Paint. I can get this in my local Walmart for about 50 cents. It's a beautiful dark purplish color as well. I just put two thin coats on all the parts of the clothing that I want to be a purple. Now you could use Nagaroth Night that's made by Citadel. That costs $4.55 though, which is about 5 times as much. Now once you get your Wild Iris done, the next thing you do, of course, is a dry brush. Now for the dry brushing on this one, I use Lilac Mist by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents on my local Walmart, and what I do is I just do a quick dry brushing all over the purple robes that I did earlier. Now dry brushing does a couple of things, and the first thing that it does, it creates the illusion of depth on your miniature. What ends up happening is that the pigments of the paint actually catch up on the raised surfaces of the miniature while leaving the darker color in the recesses. So you have like this interesting highlighting effect that takes place, like folds and creases in the fabric, for example. Now you will have this kind of chalky pastel look afterwards you get done. Do not stress out about that. And the reason why is because when we get to our oil washing phase, that transition is going to smooth out between our base coats and our dry brushing, and it's going to look perfectly fine. Now, if you wanted to use something from Citadel for Lilac Paint Mist, you will need to use Decala Lilac, which costs $4.55, which is 9 times more than the stuff I use from Walmart, and does exactly the same thing. Now, the next series of colors we're going to use are for the leather goods as well as for the, I guess you would call it a tabard, I guess, what the guy's wearing in front of his chest. Now, these are for all the leather goods. Now, for all the brown leather goods, things like his belts and his holsters, for example, I use 2 thin coats at Apple Barrel's Territorial Beige. Once again, provided by Walmart. It costs 50 cents for 2 of this stuff. The equivalent color to this, of course, would be Baylor Brown, which costs $4.55 from Citadel, which is about 9 times as much. For the tabard, which looks like old parchment that runs down in front of his chest, I use 2 thin coats of khaki Khaki by Apple Barrel Paint. Once again, also costing 50 cents at my local Walmart. The equivalent to that would be, I believe, Morgas Bone, which costs $4.55 for that color. And then finally, for his boots and gloves, I picked out 2 thin layers of Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint, which also costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. And the color coordination of that would be Espern Gray, which costs $4.55 from Citadel. Now, what I do, of course, I just pick out those leather goods. I just put in 2 thin layers of these leather colors directly onto the miniature, and then from there, I'm ready to move on to our next detail. And the next detail I'll be focusing on is the walking stick, the cane that Espern Lorcano actually walks around with. Now for that, I just put 2 thin layers of Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. I get this stuff from my local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just put 2 thin coats directly onto the walking sticks. That way it looks like it's made out of wood. Now the color for this would be Wildwood. It costs $7.80 from Citadel, and that would be the Games Workshop equivalent to that material. Now, regardless of what leather good we use, we're going to dry brush all the leather goods we just did just now with a thin layer of Folk Arts Pale Gray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. This stuff is absolutely amazing. It's made by Folk Art. Just do a quick dusting real quick on the pavement, as well as the khaki, a territorial beige, as well as the burnt umber that we did earlier. Now, the reason why I'm using this one color over everything else is because I was just too lazy to actually get different colors to do dry brushing. After all, the Folk Art does exactly the same thing as everything else, and I didn't really have to go through all the different colors and make it happen. Besides, when we add the oil wash to it anyway, it's going to look like it's brown anyhow, so it works out better for us. Now, the color that's being used by Citadel, that would be the equivalent to this, of course, would be Ulthuan Gray, which costs about $4.55 as opposed to 75 cents from Walmart. And once you get done with your dry brushing on those leather goods, we can move on to our next details. Now, the next thing we're going to work on, of course, are all the metallic elements on this miniature, and as weird as it may sound, by finishing with these metallic elements, we've pretty much finished up a majority of this miniature, actually. So I use basically 3 colors for all the metallics on these characters. I use Copper by Folk Art, as well as Gunmetal Gray, as well as Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. All 3 of these products can be found at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. The copper equivalent from Citadel would be Screaming Bell, which costs $7.80, which is 10 times as much. Lead Belcher by Citadel would cost 10 times as much as opposed to Gunmetal Gray, and then Retributor Armor would cost $7.80 for that color as well. And as you can see, I just painted the details that I wanted to have copper as well as gold. For most of the actual metallic elements on this guy, primarily use gold, so things like the crest of his helmet, the armor panels that he's wearing on his chest as well as his shoulder, I picked out 2 thin layers of Emperor's Gold. Now for all the silver pieces, I did things like the charms on his belt, the weapons on his belt as well as his face mask, and as well as for his cloak. I also put some of those details in Gunmetal Gray for that, as well as copper, like little items like on his belt, his utility belt, as well as armor. All those metallic elements, I just picked those out in 2 thin layers, and then we can start working on the finer details. So like I said before, after we get done with metallics, actually the rest of it's just really small details for the most part. So I use 2 colors. I use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The color closest to this, I believe, is Cyberite Green is what it's called. And so because I just take some Lime Sherbet, what I do is I pick out some details. Things like the eye of the jewel that's hanging off his belt, as well as the eye holes on his mask as well. He's got like a third eye looking thing on his forehead, as well as the lenses of his mask. So I just picked out 2 thin layers of Lime Sherbet. And then of course I have some couple of like tubes and things running off his body, so to make that contrast nicely against the rest of the miniature, I picked out 2 thin layers of Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. The color equivalent to this would be Talisar Blue by Games Workshop, which costs more than 10 times as much as $7.80 for that color. And the last few details we're going to work on is on the backpack of Espern Lorcano. And the reason why we're doing that is because he does have a little purity seal that's on his backpack, then his little oxygen tank back there. So for that, for the little wax seal, I use Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents. The color equivalency to that from Games Workshop would be Screamer Pink, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55 for that color. And then for the little script parchment, I just put that in 2 thin layers of khaki. And as weird as it may sound, we are pretty much done with this miniature. So with that being said, let's go and talk about how we're going to do the base work real quick. So for the base work on this, I just picked this out into 2 thin layers of Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. This stuff costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The color equivalent to this would be Slanesh Gray, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55. I just put 2 thin layers on the Pewter Gray directly onto the base. Now, unfortunately, a little bit of the white undercoat will poke through the Pewter Gray, but that is perfectly fine because we're going to use an off-white color anyways to dry brush this base, so it doesn't really matter all that much. So once again, we're just going to dry brush the base real fast with a thin layer of Pale Gray by Folk Art. As you can see, it does a beautiful job of capturing the raised surfaces of the texturing on the bases as well. This is this typical kind of like urban base I usually do for most of my Necromunda miniatures. And since I don't really play Blackstone Fortress, the game too much, I'm using this as a Necromunda miniature instead. So giving it the same treatment I give most of my Necromunda miniatures. So the last step, of course, is to do an oil wash. And like I said before at the beginning of the video, we are doing an oil wash for this. And what oil washing is that you take a single wash, you put it all over the entirety of the miniature to do that last washing stage. Now, for a lot of people, when they do a quick paint method like this, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do this, which is perfectly fine. Army Painter Strong Tone does exactly as advertised. It's a wonderful product. The only problem, though, is it runs $32 per can, so it can be quite expensive. So if you're looking for a cheaper alternative, my suggestion for you is to use Midwax Polyshade and Mission Oak, which costs $6.99, almost 5 times less than the Army Painter Strong Tone. Now, as you can see, what the oil wash does, it does a couple of things. The first thing it does, of course, is that it seeps down directly into the recesses of the miniature and brings out a lot of the details that we couldn't see earlier. So the individual grooves of the metal on his faceplate, the folds of his fabric, the texturing of the tabard he's wearing, it brings all those details out that we couldn't see earlier. The second thing that the oil wash does too is it also blends the transitions between our dry brushing and our base coats, so that really powdery, chalky pastel look that we had earlier is now completely gone away, because now those color transitions have been smoothed out by the oil wash. And the third thing that the oil wash actually does as well is it also mutes down the vibrancy of our colors. There's a reason why we use such bright colors in the first place, because you knew right off the bat that this is going to darken them. Now, with Midwax Polyshade, just like with Army Painter Strong Tone, both products do contain stain, which does this. And at the same time, it also contains polyurethane in both products, which means you'll have a hard plastic clear coat finish on these miniatures that will protect them from harm. So because you'll need to wait 24 hours for this stuff to completely dry and cure. For my suggestion to you, I would recommend making the oil wash in the very last stage of whatever you're actually painting. I usually paint in the evening, so I usually use my oil washing stage as the very last part of the evening, as the very last step before I clean up. That way, 24 hours later, when I come back to painting my miniatures, the stuff is dried and cured, and then I can move on from there. Now, this next step, of course, is completely optional. I'm going to use a matte varnish on my miniature, and the reason why is because, like I said before, the polyurethane is going to have a high gloss finish on the Midwax Polyshade. Now, if you do like that high gloss finish, you could, of course, skip this stage. This stage could be completely optional for you, but me, I like my miniatures to be a little bit more matte-based. So because I use Krylon Matte Varnish Spray, which costs $5.99 at my local Walmart, I just do the once over real quick with the Krylon Matte Varnish Spray, and it mutes down the vibrancy of that sheen from the polyurethane, and actually has more of a matte finish. Now, if you want to use exactly the same product from Games Workshop, you'll need to buy Citadel's Mutatorium Varnish, which costs $19.50, which is about 3 times more than the Krylon Matte finish that I use. Alright, the very last stage, of course, is to rim the bases. Now for this, because I like to use this miniature for Necromunda, I'm going to use 2 thin layers of Skyline by Folk Art. This stuff costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. The Games Workshop equivalent to this color would be Rust Gray, which costs $4.55, about 5 times as much. So because all I do is just put 2 thin layers of Skyline along the rim of the bases, this is what I use for all my Necromunda miniatures, and then once you're done with this stage, we're pretty much finished with the miniature. And there you go. This is the end result that we showed earlier at the very beginning of the slide. This is what your Espern Lorcano would look like by using the Cheapskate method in order to paint up your miniature. You got a beautiful tabletop standard. At the same time, you saved a ton of cash at the same time using the same methods that we do. So now that we're done talking about exactly how we paint up this miniature, let's go and talk about materials that you need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve exactly the same result as we did, but using those name brand products instead. So this is what you'll need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter in order to paint up the same way that we did. You'll need to buy Nagaroth Night, Dakala Lilac, Screamer Pink, Sabrite Green, all colors which cost $4.55 for those colors. You also need to buy Pot of Wildwood, which costs $7.80 for that, as well as Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Slaanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Rust Gray, Ulthuan Gray, and all those colors cost $4.55 for those. You also need to buy a pot of Talisar Blue, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Retributor Armor, and Astral Granite, and each of those cost $7.80 as well. You also need to buy a can of Korax White Spray, which costs $17, Mutatorium Varnishes cost $19.50, as well as a pot of Army Painter Strong Tone, which costs $32 for that. So assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time for Citadel as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total investment of $160.80 in order to paint up your miniature exactly the same way we did, except by using those name brand products. Now, when you compare everything against my Cheapskate method, which costs a grand total of $18.88, we are saving you $141.92 to paint up your miniature to the exact same standard that we did. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can quickly and cheaply paint up Espern Lorcano for your games of Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. At the same time, we're also saving you $141.92 at exactly the same way. So if you're looking for a really quick and cheap, easy way to paint up Espern Lorcano and you're looking for a way to save a lot of money while doing so, I suggest the Cheapskate method in your future painting projects. So that's good to do for this one, you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.